Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Old Time Rock and Roll. I'm your host, David Tear. Every day I profile a different rock and roll artist whose birthday it is today, and today is October 9th, 2023. Today happens to be the birthday of none other than John Lennon. I'm sure you've all heard of him. He was the lead singer of one of the greatest bands of all time, maybe even the greatest, the Beatles. I'm sure you've all heard of the Beatles. They were a British band that were around from 1960 to 1970. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the two main writers, music writers, and they also, of course, had George Harrison and Ringo Starr. Richard Starkey was his real name. They went through a long history. This was first picture I showed was them on the Ed Sullivan Show, and on January 9th, 1964. This is when they made their TV debut in the USA, and it was a huge sensation, and they were a worldwide sensation. Everybody knows that. And they went through a long history. John was kind of a troublemaker at first, and he did something pretty stupid in the middle of the Beatles' career. He gave an interview in which he said the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and it caused a big outrage in the South, in the USA. There was a big ban on Beatles records. People were destroying their Beatles records and all their Beatles paraphernalia, and it kind of put a big dent on their career. They started getting death threats, and as a result, they stopped touring in the USA. Of course, they still remained hugely popular, didn't turn everybody off on the Beatles. They still had a huge following. As a matter of fact, they went through a big transition. In '67, they kind of started the psychedelic era. Their original manager, George Martin, died, and then they kind of started their own thing, their kind of psychedelic phase. Their first big album, psychedelic album, was Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. A lot of people consider that one of the greatest albums, maybe even the greatest album of all time. Of course, you can see they look very different now. And so that's pretty much the Beatles. I think I'm not going to go on more about the Beatles per se, but I'm going to start talking about John's personal life. Um, John had two wives. His first wife was Cynthia, and I don't know her first name, but she became Cynthia Lennon. They got married in 1962. They got divorced, I believe, in 1968. They had a son named Julian. That's him on the left, and Julian actually became a singer on his own as he grew up. This was in the '80s. This was actually after John was tragically murdered in 1980. Mid '80s, Julian had some hits of his own. I'm not going to go through those, but I thought he was a pretty good singer. I thought he sounded a lot like John. He was popular for a while. Um, and Of course, after after his first marriage, he married this woman on the right. Her name was Yoko Ono. She was a Japanese woman, and she was also a songwriter and a very good artist. And she kind of encouraged him to take a new direction. They formed their own band, and this is even while he was still with the Beatles in 1969. They formed a band called the Plastic Ono Band. I don't think Paul was very happy about this. This might have spelled the end of their career a year later. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I don't think John's marriage to Yoko helped things with the Beatles. Anyway, they became kind of big on their own. Another thing they did, they were big. Both of them were big opponents of peace, world peace. And one thing they did shortly after they got married, they had a couple what they called bed-ins for peace. This was them in Amsterdam in March of 1969, I believe. I think this is even how they spent their honeymoon. And they had another one. These were week-long bed-ins. So they had first one in Amsterdam and then later in Montreal. And I think at that time that caused some controversy. But that's what they did. That was their way of demonstrating for world peace and I guess for free sex. a lot of other stuff. But anyway, they had another kid. John had a kid with Yoko named Sean Ono Lennon, and I don't think he became a singer, but there's a picture of him there. And there's him with Paul's daughter. Her name was what was it? Um, I don't remember her name right now. Stella McCartney and Sean Ono Lennon. That's I think I don't know when that picture was taken. Probably 90s, early 2000s. But anyway, and then I should talk about John's music. So, yeah, the Beatles broke up in 1970. That was very heartbreaking for a lot of people. Um, a lot of people wish they stayed together. I kind of do too. But John, they all became successful solo artists. In particular, John. I think John and Paul were the two most successful solo artists. They were all successful in one way or another. They all had hits, but like I said earlier, John and Paul were the two chief songwriters of the Beatles, and they continued to do a lot of great music on their own after the Beatles broke up. And John had several albums. I think this was a second big one. It was called Imagine, and that had the song Imagine on it. This came out in 1971. I guess he's out of order, but some people consider Imagine one of the greatest songs of all time. I remember when I first heard Imagine. I heard it actually right after I heard the news about John's murder. And I remember, when I was really shocked. I was in college. I had just started college at the University of Michigan. This was December 8th, 1980. Everybody in my dorm was really shocked. They just heard it on the news that John had been shot. And the first thing I did, I could hardly believe it myself, but the first thing I did was I turned on my stereo, and they just happened to be playing the song Imagine. And I'd never heard it before in my life. And I was really, really moved. You can imagine, especially because he'd just been murdered. But it's a beautiful song. It's really a beautiful peace out anthem. And it's become a big classic, and I love that song. And some other albums of his, like I said, his first album, I might have forgotten to put the picture of that, but his first big album was called the Plastic Ono Band, and that was his first album with Yoko. And they had, at least in the re-release, they had the songs "Instant Karma" and "Give Peace a Chance." Those were their two first big hits. And this is, like I said, while they were still with the Beatles. And but then they had a few other albums after that. They had an album called Mind Games. I'm not sure if this is it. I forget which is which, but Mind Games came out in 1973. That had the title track Mind Games. Kind of a strange song. I never really understood it, but it's not a bad song. He also had an album called Walls and Bridges, and that one had a song called Number Nine Dream, another kind of strange song. I think it was inspired by a dream he had. I never really understood that song, but he also had a song called Whatever Gets You Through the Night. That was actually a number one song for him. I believe Elton John was also featured on that song. Not one of my favorites of his, but it was a number one hit. Um, and then he had an album in '75. He had an album called Rock and Roll. This had a lot of oldies. This album was all remakes of oldies from the '50s and early '60s. And his biggest hit on this album was his remake of "Stand by Me," which was originally done by Benny King. And he did an interesting version of it. I don't think it's as good as Benny King's. He has kind of a loud, kind of a high whiny voice in it, but I think he does a good job. He also had songs, remakes of Bebopalula, Ain't That a Shame, Peggy Sue, Ya Ya, and several others. His biggest album, though, and this became a posthumous album. It was actually released just a month before his murder. Came out in November 1980. It's called Double Fantasy, and it was like the title kind of suggests. It was actually a double album. Half of the songs are sung by John and half by his wife Yoko. And I think she was a terrible singer, unfortunately. He sang some really good songs on this album, though. His One of his biggest hits, I think it was actually his biggest hit, was "Starting Over," just like starting over, and that song was number one. I think even before he was killed, yeah, and it stayed number one for a couple weeks afterwards, and so sort of a semi-posthumous number one for him. And there were some other hits of his that were became posthumous hits. That was the first hit on the album. He also had "Woman," "Watching the Wheels," and he also had a song called "Beautiful Boy," which I think is a really beautiful song. I don't think it was a hit, but beautiful song about his son. I think it was his son Sean, and they actually used that in a movie with Richard Dreyfuss. I think it's a really excellent movie. It's called Mr. Holland's Opus. Richard Dreyfuss. It came out in 1996, and Richard Dreyfuss plays a music teacher, a classical music teacher. But there's a beautiful scene in that movie. If you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend it. But there's a scene in which Richard Dreyfuss actually sings that song. Of course, he's not a good singer, but he sings it for his son in the movie who's deaf, and it's just a beautiful scene because he's singing about his son, even though the song was originally about John Lennon's son. So anyway, I highly recommend that movie. But this was a good album, and actually, in another posthumous album in 1984. This was 4 years after he was killed. This one was called Milk and Honey. And this had one other big hit of his called Nobody Told Me, which is a good song. Kind of a strange song, but I remember the video. Kind of strange lyrics, but I like it. And anyway, that's pretty much all the music he did. But he was an amazing musician, one of the best, I think. And of course, we all know about his murder. I mentioned it several times already. Terrible thing. I was just shocked when I heard about his murder. I mean, it was really a tragic day for a lot of people, including me. And I don't understand the guy who killed him. I mean, he was killed by one of his fans. His name was David Chapman, and I don't even know what was David Chapman's problem. He's obviously insane, and I don't know what made him kill John. It was a horrible thing. He was killed in New York City where he was living at the time. I think he was living in the Dakota. Uh, was a big apartment complex near Central Park, and uh, it was just a very tragic thing. And of course, just huge crowds started gathering after he was killed. They were just really mortified by his death, and it was a very tragic death. And he was a wonderful musician. Not only that, he was a big pacifist. I don't just love his music, but I loved what he stood for, and he was a legend. And that's pretty much all I have to say about John Lennon. And I hope you enjoyed my video, and I'll see you next time.